All right, so yes, I was going to say, are you familiar with this? Who knows what this logo is? Right, well, oh, wow, okay, amazing, all of you do. Well, it's the heartbleed bug, right? And the reason I'm starting my talk about it is the heartbleed bug has, well, first of all, it's a bug that had a huge impact, right? And one of the examples is 4.5 million medical records were actually lost their confidentiality, right? And the other big number attached to that bug is the actual estimated cost to the industry, which is $500 million, which is a sizable amount of money. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about money in this talk because even though I know this is something as a community we don't really like to talk about that much, when we talk about sustainability and open source, you kind of have to talk about money. So it was a huge bug that had a big impact. And what it really did is it was, at least I see it as a pivotal moment in how open source was perceived by the tech industry, and that for three reasons. The first one is it really showed that open source is everywhere, right? The OpenSSL library that had that bug was, well, you know, is in roughly 2/3 of active sites on the internet, right? The other aspect is open source is at critical areas. This is a crypto library, right? It's not some fancy UI or something like this. It's something that is critical to how the internet works. And then the last part, and the one that was probably the most sort of surprising to everyone was, well, what caused that bug? And one of the biggest reasons for that bug is how underfunded, the whole open source ecosystem is. And we learned that basically OpenSSL was one person full-time plus a roughly $2,000 per year budget, right? And so this would have triggered a pretty large conversation in the community about sustainability. And we started hearing stories of maintainer breakdown, burnout, maintainers being tired of working on open source projects. And that's also at the same time that we started to really look for solutions for that. And so one of the first things that open source maintainers looked for is how they could actually use existing solutions that were designed at for other things than software open source itself, and use it to sort of make their open source practice more sustainable. So one of the first system that was used was Patreon. Patreon, who was originally designed for artists to try to create a meaningful revenue stream for artist work. And one software developer and open source developer in particular, Evan Yu, the creator of Vue.js, was able to really organize himself a solution where people who were using Vue.js were really interested to fund his work on it. And that led to him being able to net roughly $17,000 monthly to work on the project full-time, right? So that's a really nice success story for sort of like an open source maintainer, thank you, working on full-time on open source. But you know, the kick is it really reproducible? And the answer to that is not really, right? This is sort of like a one-off success story, and it's not really a common solution to the problem of open source sustainability. So we've seen a lot of other things. One of the interesting solution that is right now for this problem is Gitcoin. And Gitcoin is interesting because it's actually a whole ecosystem of tools designed to help open source maintainers make money or make a living out of their work. There's 2 or 3 different products, one of which is actually also called Gitcoin. So that makes it a bit confusing. It's both one product and the company itself. And what Gitcoin is basically a GitHub issue market. So if you have a software bug that you want someone to work on an open source project, you attach a bounty to an issue, and then open source developers can come and contribute to that issue, send a pull request, and once that pull request is merged, they actually get paid in Ether coins because of blockchain, right? And so that Gitcoin in 2018 gave away about $500,000 of bounties. And so another part of that Gitcoin ecosystem is CodeFund, which is an ad network that is so-called ethical. The ads are contextual. They're not based on tracking users. And they're focused on displaying ads on websites of open source projects. And of course, one of the big value is for hiring purposes, right? If you're looking for a developer, open source project is a great place to put an ad about the open positions at your company. So that has been making roughly $10,000 in monthly revenue and redistributing 6,000 of those to the community of maintainers of open source projects. Of course, when you talk about software, there's always the VC route, right? And I know this community is not a community that particularly is inclined to go the VC route, but nonetheless, with all of the acquisitions and sort of like excitement around the Red Hat acquisition, around lots of IPOs for large sort of open source based companies, it's still something that's a solution. And there's even now a sort of dedicated fund in the making called OSS Capital, which is basically trying to fund open source projects to turn them into large business with valuable exits for the VCs. Another exciting solution is Open Collective. So Open Collective was started as a way to help communities self-organize and fund themselves. And it sort of came around roughly at the same time as all of this questioning in the open source world around sustainability. And so it has really surfed that wave and has been really helpful around the open source community. What it does basically is it provides a legal and accounting infrastructure for open source projects to be able to accept funds and redistribute them to the developers or the people actually working on the project. Open Collective has one really big success story, which is Webpack, which in 2017 made $250,000 off of the platform and has made $400,000 in yearly funding last year. And what's really interesting, it's a win-win story because its biggest contributor, which is Trivago, the hotel booking European website, has gotten a lot out of it in terms of visibility, and it has helped them hire really good top engineers. So it's an interesting model where developers actually get funded and are able to work full-time on a project, and the companies funding them actually really getting something out of it. And actually, Trivago was also really happy about the work, the technical source code work that was done, which really helped some of the work that we're doing. The problem Open Collective has, however, is a long tail problem, which is that pretty much all of the money goes to like a few projects, and then after that, it's very little to a lot of projects. Late last year, Open Collective added Back Your Stack to its offering. So Back Your Stack is just a little piece of software that goes on GitHub, looks at your organization on GitHub, looks at all of the packages that you have and builds a dependency tree of all of the software you're using as an organization, all of the open source software you're using as an organization, and then lets you, compares that with the ones that are on Open Collective, and then basically lets you either choose to fund some of those or give a lump amount that is redistributed to all of the projects you rely on. And that's a similar solution to the one that Tidelift has created. But Tidelift has sort of like a Red Hat business model, but for the long tail of open source projects. So basically what it does is, using the same sort of like software that Back Your Stack does, what it does is it looks at all of the open source software you're relying on and then offers security updates, maintenance, and guarantees, basically, around the open source software that you use for a fee, and it then uses that fee to pay the actual maintainers working on those projects to keep them updated and secure. Right? So that's the idea. It's a similar business model than Red Hat, except for like a much larger, for much smaller projects. And while it's really brand new, and so we don't really have a good idea of how effective and how impactful it's going to be in the ecosystem. So we talked about a number of different solutions that have emerged over the last couple of, 3 or 4 years around making open source projects more sustainable. And what I want to do quickly now is look at sort of the issues that we have with these 3 projects, and was these, 4 or 5 projects I talked about, and then sort of like propose a larger solution to that problem. And so those 3 issues are, the first one is one of scale, right? So I'll go into that shortly. The second one is one of misaligned incentives between open source projects that are becoming professional projects and developers relying on those projects. And then the third one is just a question of whether it's a good idea to actually limit sort of open source practice to a few subset of developers and not bring it to developers at large. I don't know if you've seen this really nice small video sequence that explained the American debt a couple of years ago. It was a YouTube video made by, we can't really see it here, but it's made by a website called demonocracy.info. And they were really kind to let me use those graphics to sort of make the point about scale. So that is a $100 bill, right? If you stack 100 of those, you have $10,000, and that is the monthly revenue of CodeFund, the ad network we were talking about before. Now if you stack together 100 of those bills, you get $1 million. And that is the amount of money that Open Collective has redistributed over a year. And it's the same amount also that Tidelift has committed to pay developers. So that sounds like a sizable amount of money. But let's compare that to the worldwide developer population, which is estimated to be roughly around a bit above 22 million developers in the world. A bit more than half of them are full-time. Then you have sort of like a third-ish that are part-time, and non-professionals are sort of like the rest. So if you do some quick back-of-the-envelope math, you're going to see really quickly that the numbers are astounding. So if you account for 12 million full-time developers, and you take an average pay of $65,000 per year, we can sort of discuss whether that's a bit too high or a bit too low, but it actually gets me to a nice round number at the end. So please bear with me, okay? So that gives us $780 billion spent in wages for full-time developers in the world per year, right? If you add to that 6 million part-time developers at $35K a year, right? And you add that, it gives you a total of $1 trillion per year in developer wages, right? So let's have a look at what that means in comparison to the kind of money that these solutions are providing right now. So if we stack 100 of those $1 million onto a pallet, right, we get $100 million, okay? So to get to $1 billion, we need 10 of those pallets, all right? If we make a square of 10 by 10 of those pallets, now we get $10 billion worth of bills, all right? And so to get to $1 trillion, well, we have to stack a lot of those, right? 100 of them, okay? So if you compare with the little person that's, over there, down here, right? And the $1 million amount that Open Collective is collecting, and you compare that to the sheer size of developers in the world and how much money are actually paid to developers, it is a really, 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 really tiny amount. So the second thing that to me is a bit of a problem was the solutions that we've been looking at and focused on to solve open source sustainability is what DHH refers to as misaligned incentives. And he talks quite a bit about that in a blog post of his called The Perils of Mixing Open Source and Money. It's an old post, but I think sort of like the crux of the post is really interesting, which is to say that one of the key values of open source is it's actually built by people who are trying to scratch an itch, right? Solve a problem that they have in the particular context that they're in, and then once that problem is solved, move back on to the core of their business. And if we really start separating this and have on one side developers that are open source developers focused on creating open source code, and on the other side developers which are consumers of that open source code, we lose sort of this value. And it's interesting to see that if you look at developers working on the Linux kernel, you actually see that 93% of them, 92% of them are actually working on the kernel as part of their job. And so we tend to look at the focus on finding solutions for the 7.7% that are up there. And I agree that the Linux kernel is probably like a bit special. But it's to say that we're really looking at, both from a sort of money perspective and from an actual real life perspective, we're too focused on this small area up there and not on the big picture. And the last point is open source is actually really, really cool. I mean, I guess this is the case for pretty much everyone that's in this room, but I owe my whole career to my involvement with open source. I've met a lot of my friends in that place. I've learned pretty much everything from working in the open source world, and I would find it really sad if we suddenly decided that this was only something that a really small percentages of open source developers would have access to, and not developers at large. So with that said, well, we need to find a solution to, a more general solution to make open source accessible to more developers than just the ones that are focused on open source. And for that, we need to better understand what the true value of open source is. I'm sure you've all seen this diagram at some point, right? It's this classical flow diagram where you have problems in coffee coming in, right? An engineer is sort of handling that and has as output a solution, hopefully, and also as a byproduct byproduct So what happens when we are more specific and turn that for a software engineer? Well, nothing much changes except the solution is encoded in code. That's what the output is. So let's look at what happens when we have a software engineer working on open source code. Well, what happens is the output is open source code that suddenly goes into this large pool of comments. And in this large pool of comments, we have other engineers working and also outputting open source code, right? And they usually come with a different coffee pot and a different set of problems. And as they start working together, there are all of these new things that happen. You have conversations between companies that otherwise wouldn't have talked together. You have mentoring that happen of younger developers by more senior ones. You have networking that happens at events like this one and other events in the industry. And all of this, actually, if you remember the sarcasm byproduct I mentioned before, all of this actually creates a whole bunch of byproducts, right? All of these interactions and all of these conversations. And there are actually plenty of these. And they touch a number of different aspects of software development. And you can actually regroup them in sort of like 4 large categories, which are byproducts that impact the project itself that you're working on. A classical one is you get better documentation. You improve code quality by working in the open with more people on the project. Then you have a number of byproducts. Some people call those like second-order consequences that actually impact individuals, right? Working on open source, I mean, we all know that. Like, it levels you up. It helps you with your soft skills. And it has a whole bunch of really interesting impact at the individual level. And it has also lots of impact at a team level by increasing efficiencies, for example. Or also a concept I really like that we can't talk about today because we don't have the time, which is called a knowledge spillover. And finally, it has really positive impact, as I talked about with the Trivago example before, for the companies themselves who have engineers working in open source. And I just quickly want to give you 2 examples of that. The first one is recent research by Professor Frank Nagel from Harvard Business School that has shown that teams working on the Linux kernel that actually contributing back to the project are twice as effective on their own work than teams that are just freeloading, right? So that's not like 20% more effective, right? It's actually, and the research is actually really interesting to read, and it's really deep work, and it accounts for a whole lot of variables that it corrects. But it's really making teams a lot more productive. And then, well, I'm well aware that Facebook is in the news a lot these days for pretty bad things. But outside of that, when it really made a push to drive open source, what created software projects like React, it actually started asking questions to new recruits as to what had made them sign up for the job. And 75% of new recruits at Facebook actually said that Facebook's open source program was one of the key reasons why they had taken the job. So all that to say that when we look at open source, we often look at the actual code itself as the value, right? But it turns out that there's a huge amount of value in the process itself, and that we've been really bad as a community to A, realize that, and B, figure out how to capture that value. To me, the solution to open source sustainability is helping companies understand that value and actually help them leverage it, right? So show the companies what's in it for them when they have engineers contributing. And that's it, folks. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions. We welcome questions.
Up there, yes?
Oh, yep,
Oh,
I deliver.
sustainability, right?
Right. Oh, look what you did there.
Thank you.
Hello. This is all good and great for companies which can afford to give and have part of open source as part of their workflow that are large enough. But what about, like in my community, most of the ecosystem is actually made up of very small companies, as in one-man, two-man people companies. Like, how can they also give back to open source?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that like that, frankly.
I do.
You do, wonderful.
Sponsor meetups. It's inexpensive compared to most other forms of sponsorship, and it still gives value to the community by helping to bring together developers and supporting their in-person engagement. So if you are a small shop but you still want to give back to open source, buying something delicious for your local meetup group can be a great way to give back. And if you're on a budget, you go to the local supermarket and buy lots of snacks. It works. I'm just saying. Other questions? No, lovely. Human at the front.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I really like the illustration that you made with the stack of bills comparing the open source community versus the rest of the industry. But I believe the small stack was mostly the examples that you listed, right?
Yeah, mostly.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it was. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, for example, the small stack, the $1 million was the amount of money that Open Collective is redistributing.
But then you mentioned Facebook open source program. I know Google has some.
Absolutely.
A lot of companies have that
Absolutely.
already. Do you have the numbers for what already exists from the companies to have an illustration of that?
That's a great question. I don't have the numbers, and they would be really interesting to get. So basically, I think the question is, sorry, because I sort of interrupted the last bit of your question, but I feel like the question is, how much are companies actually contributing in human resources, basically? I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a good question, and I think that this is what we should tend towards, right? Is get more companies contributing on the scale of these large tech companies. I don't have an answer to what number that actually is.
No, but I think it's, sorry, I'm interjecting because I used to work for a big company that had an open source program office, and it was one of the ones you mentioned. I think it is a reasonable thing for us to talk to our friends who are at big company open source programs offices and ask them to publish data on that.
That's a good point.
Because a lot of them are getting great recruitment value out of saying we have great support for open source software. So if they're actually able to publish metrics against what those contributions are, that's going to look better to would-be employees. I will talk to former coworkers.
Wonderful.
I'm not trying to bogart your Q&A
No,
session.
that's great.
Sorry.
That's better, actually. We have
Nice human.
1 minute left. Last question, I imagine.
Hello. First of all, nice talk, nice presentation.
Thank you.
I work at a rather small company. We've got 6 developers, no thing like quality assurance. Insurance, whatever, you know what I mean. Do you think that for such a small company, investing into open source makes sense?
So that's, well, it's a similar question as the one we had first. I think it does, but I think it actually needs a real strategy behind it. I've seen a number of small companies actually use their open source practice as a way to get clients. So it sort of depends what kind of company you are. If you're building software for others, or if you're building software yourself. I think, I mean, there's a whole life cycle of when it makes sense for a company to invest in open source. And usually, like early stage startups are not usually a good, in a good position to do that. It just doesn't really make sense. But if you're building software for other companies, it could be a strategic advantage to show that you're building open source. It could help on a marketing way, or it could also help you design solutions that can fit multiple of your clients and open source those solutions, and then actually be able to make larger margins by reselling that same solution to different companies. So there's lots of it's really like tactical sort of thing you want to do. Do we have time for an extra one?
No, we can do one more. Eric and Lori, if you want to start setting up, please come on up to the front. Any folks, we have another question? I deliver.
So first of all, thank you. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. And I have a question. I'm actually dealing with a corner of the software market that is still not quite familiar with open source. Can you understand me?
I can barely hear you, actually. You have to...
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. And so what I see is like a lot of people don't understand these licenses. People are afraid, and we're now doing an open source project in this area. And I think for some, this is actually a bit scary that this is happening now. So what is like best practice to convince people that this is I mean, people will have to move, right? People will have to change their business model to some degree, but that this is not a bad change, or that people can actually benefit from it.
Yeah, so I think the fastest answer to that is the same problem. The companies that are in those markets facing, it's a similar problem that the one that they're facing with digital transformation in general. And so it should be tackled at the same time. And if it's done properly, it can even help leapfrog a number of companies that have done digital transformation before, but haven't actually moved to more of like an open source model for developing software. Does that work as a quick answer? We can talk after the... Okay.
I have a shameless plug. I wrote a white... Sorry, I didn't... I feel like a jerk.
I could do this. I mean, I'm going to do the shameless plug, too, after you're done.
Okay, so I wrote a white paper with some collaborators from the FinTech Open Source Foundation called the Business Value Benefits of Open Source for Financial Services Firms, which are traditionally extremely conservative. And all of the arguments in there about why it is important for financial services firms to adopt open source, contribute to open source, operate in an open source way will be equally applicable to, I think, really any industry. So if you have conservative folks at your company, the text is CC BY, copy, paste, remove, add in your industry, reuse, and use it to convince the right people.
Where do I find it?
At L Hawthorne on Twitter. I will tweet it at you. I will email it to you. There's my phone number. Send me a signal, a WhatsApp, a DM, or something.
You're Leslie.
I'm Leslie. Oh, hi, I'm Leslie, yes. That's Laura. All right.
And so my shameless plug was I actually do that as a living as a consulting business.
And you should give Toby.
So you can reach out.
All right. Thank you, Toby.
Who needs the mic?